Tonight, we journey into the ancient wisdom of Proverbs, a book that has guided hearts and minds for thousands of years. These aren't complex theological arguments or distant philosophical concepts. They're practical truths about how to live well, how to find peace, how to navigate the challenges that every human being faces. Before we begin, I'd love to know what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Feel free to share in the comments. And if you find value in this journey tonight, please consider subscribing so we can continue exploring these timeless teachings together. Now, get comfortable. Let your body settle into rest. There's nothing you need to do but listen. Let's begin. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living without wisdom. Not the tiredness of hard work or physical effort, but the deep fatigue of making the same mistakes over and over. Of wandering through life without a compass, without principles to guide you, without understanding why things keep going wrong. You try so hard you mean well, but somehow you keep ending up in the same painful places, the same destructive patterns, the same confusion about which way to turn. The book of Proverbs speaks directly to this exhaustion. It was written by Solomon, a king who asked God not for wealth or power, but for wisdom. And God granted his request so abundantly that people traveled from distant lands just to hear him speak. But Solomon didn't keep this wisdom to himself. He wrote it down in short, memorable sayings so that ordinary people like you and me, could learn to live with greater understanding, greater peace, greater skill in navigating life's complexities. These proverbs aren't just ancient advice. They're observations about how reality actually works. They're like maps drawn by someone who has walked the territory and knows where the pitfalls are, where the good paths lead, where the dangerous turns hide. And the remarkable thing is that human nature hasn't changed in 3,000 years. The wisdom that guided people then guides us now because we face the same temptations, the same fears, the same choices between wisdom and foolishness. Let me tell you about a man named Marcus, who learned this the hard way. Marcus was ambitious, intelligent, full of energy and ideas. In his 20s, he started a business with a friend. They had complementary skills, shared vision, real chemistry as partners. The business grew quickly, and within 2 years they were making good money. Life seemed to be working out exactly as Marcus had hoped. But success brought new challenges. As the money increased, so did the decisions about how to spend it. Marcus wanted to expand aggressively, to open new locations, to hire more people. His partner counseled patience, wanted to build slowly, to make sure their foundation was solid before growing too fast. Marcus found this frustrating. Why wait? Why not seize the opportunity while they had momentum? The disagreements became more frequent. Marcus began to see his partner as an obstacle rather than an ally. He would make decisions without consulting him, would override his concerns, would dismiss his cautions as fear and lack of vision. The friendship that had once been the foundation of their partnership began to crack under the weight of Marcus's impatience and pride. One day, in a moment of particular frustration, Marcus made a major financial commitment without telling his partner. He signed a lease for a new location, hired staff, bought equipment. When his partner discovered what had happened, he was devastated, not just by the financial risk Marcus had taken, but by the betrayal of trust. How could they be partners if Marcus was making major decisions alone? The partnership dissolved. It was ugly, painful, expensive. Marcus took the new location and tried to run it himself, certain he could prove his vision was right. But without his partner's careful management, without the checks and balances that had made their original business successful, things began to fall apart. Marcus had been so focused on growth that he'd neglected the basics. Cash flow problems emerged, quality declined, customers complained. Within a year, he had to close the location. He lost everything he'd built, and worse, he lost a friendship that had meant the world to him. Sitting alone one night in the empty office space he could no longer afford, Marcus found himself thinking about something his grandfather used to say. His grandfather had been a simple man, not formally educated, but possessed of what people called common sense. He would quote Proverbs sometimes, and one saying came back to Marcus now with painful clarity. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Marcus had heard those words dozens of times growing up, but he'd never really understood them. He'd thought they were about people who were obviously arrogant, people who looked down on others. He'd never seen how pride could be subtle, could hide in ambition, in confidence, in the certainty that you know better than everyone else. His pride hadn't looked like arrogance. It had looked like vision, like leadership, like strength, but it had destroyed him just the same. That night, sitting in the wreckage of his dreams, Marcus understood something he'd been too proud. Marcus lacked this fear of the Lord, not because he didn't believe in God, but because he lived as if he were God. He trusted his own judgment above all else, dismissed other perspectives, assumed he knew better. And this lack of humility, this absence of reverential awe for truth beyond himself, led him directly into destruction. The book of Proverbs is filled with contrasts between the wise person and the fool. The wise person listens to instruction, accepts correction, thinks before acting, considers consequences. The fool rejects advice, resents correction, acts impulsively, ignores warnings. These aren't judgments about intelligence or education. They're observations about how people approach life. In a village known for its craftsmen, there were two young men learning carpentry. Both were talented. Both had good teachers. Both seemed to have bright futures ahead of them. The first young man, whose name was David, approached his apprenticeship with what his teacher called a teachable spirit. When his teacher showed him a technique, David would practice it carefully, would ask questions when he didn't understand, would accept correction without defensiveness. When his teacher pointed out that he was holding the chisel at the wrong angle, David would adjust immediately, grateful for the guidance that would help him improve. The second young man, Thomas, was equally talented, but approached learning differently. He was quick to think he'd mastered a technique after trying it once or twice. When his teacher offered corrections, Thomas would often argue, would defend his way of doing things, would become irritated at suggestions that he wasn't doing it right. He saw correction as criticism, as an attack on his competence, rather than as help for his growth. As the months passed, the difference between them became more pronounced. David's skills grew steadily. He learned not just techniques, but the deeper principles behind them, the why as well as the how. He developed judgment, understanding when to use which approach, how to adapt to different types of wood, how to solve problems that didn't have obvious solutions. He became, in the truest sense, a craftsman. Thomas plateaued. He could do the basic work, but he never developed the depth of skill that comes from being truly teachable. His pride prevented him from receiving the instruction that would have made him excellent. He knew enough to get by, but not enough to excel. And worse, he developed a reputation for being difficult to work with, defensive, unwilling to learn from others. Years later, David had his own successful workshop with apprentices of his own. He taught them not just carpentry, but the humility that makes real learning possible. Thomas bounced from job to job, never quite understanding why opportunities didn't come to him, why people didn't seem to appreciate his talent. He blamed others, blamed circumstances, but never looked at the pride that had kept him from growing. This story illustrates a proverb that appears in various forms throughout the book. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Thomas always thought he was right. David knew he had more to learn. That difference in orientation toward learning made all the difference in their lives. Proverbs speaks often about the tongue, about words and how we use them. It recognizes that language is powerful, that what we say can build up or tear down, can heal or wound, can create connection or destroy relationships. In our modern world, where we're constantly speaking, texting, posting, commenting, this wisdom is more relevant than ever. There was a woman named Sarah who worked in an office where gossip was common. People would gather around the coffee machine or in the break room and talk about co-workers who weren't present. They'd share rumors, make judgments, speculate about others' personal lives. It was all framed as harmless chat, just being friendly, staying informed about what was going on. But underneath the friendly tones was something darker. The pleasure of judging others, the bonding that comes from having a common target to criticize, the sense of superiority that comes from discussing someone else's failures or problems. Sarah participated in these conversations without much thought. It was just what people did. She didn't see herself as malicious or cruel. She was just being social, fitting in with her colleagues. But over time, she noticed something troubling. The atmosphere in the office felt toxic. People seemed guarded around each other. Trust was low. Friendships were shallow because everyone knew that anything you said might become material for gossip later. The workplace, that should have been collaborative, felt more like a battlefield where everyone was looking out for themselves. One day, Sarah overheard a conversation about herself. Two colleagues were discussing her personal life, her recent breakup, speculating about what had gone wrong, making judgments about choices she'd made. Hearing her own life dissected by people who knew nothing about the full story was shocking. It wasn't that what they were saying was particularly cruel. It was the violation of it, the realization that she'd been reduced to entertainment for others, that her private pain had become their casual conversation. In that moment, she understood something visceral about gossip that all her participation had prevented her from seeing. Words have power. When you speak about someone in their absence, you're shaping how others see them. You're creating narratives, forming opinions, influencing perceptions, and you're doing it without giving that person any chance to speak for themselves, to correct misunderstandings, to provide context that might change everything. Sarah thought about a verse from Proverbs that she'd heard in church, but never really considered. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered. She'd been revealing secrets, or at least participating in conversations where others revealed them. She'd thought of herself as trustworthy, but her participation in gossip proved otherwise. True trustworthiness means keeping confidences, protecting others even in their absence, refusing to participate in conversations that diminish someone who isn't there to defend themselves. She decided to change. It wasn't easy. The next time colleagues started gossiping around the coffee machine, she excused herself. They noticed. They teased her about being too good for them now. But she held firm. She developed a simple rule. If she wouldn't say it to someone's face, she wouldn't say it behind their back. If she had a concern about someone, she'd address it with them directly or let it go. But she wouldn't participate in the destructive practice of talking about people as if they were characters in a drama rather than real human beings. Over time, something interesting happened. People began to trust Sarah more. They knew she wouldn't talk about them when they weren't around, because she didn't talk about anyone that way. She became someone people could confide in, knowing their confidences were safe. Her relationships deepened because they were built on genuine trust, rather than the false intimacy that comes from bonding over shared criticism of others. The atmosphere she created around herself was different from the general office atmosphere. It was calmer, kinder, more real. Others noticed, and some began to follow her example. Not everyone, but enough that a small pocket of actual friendship and trust formed in a workplace that had been dominated by superficiality and gossip. This is the power of applying wisdom from Proverbs. Sarah didn't do anything dramatic. She just stopped participating in gossip. But that one change, based on one principle from ancient wisdom, transformed her relationships and her experience of her workplace. Wisdom works like that. Small changes in how we act, based on true principles, create ripple effects that touch everything around us. Another theme that runs throughout Proverbs is the difference between wealth gained honestly and wealth gained through shortcuts. We live in a culture that often celebrates wealth without asking too many questions about how it was acquired. We admire success and assume that successful people must be wise, must have done things right. But Proverbs makes careful distinctions about different paths to prosperity. There was a business owner named James who ran a construction company. In the years after the financial crisis, work was scarce. Many construction companies went under, unable to survive the dramatic drop in new building. James's company struggled like everyone else. He had to lay off workers, had to turn down jobs that wouldn't be profitable, had to watch competitors close their doors. It was a painful time, full of uncertainty and fear. During this difficult period, James learned that some companies were staying afloat by cutting corners. They were using substandard materials but charging for quality ones. They were skipping safety measures to save money. They were underpaying workers, sometimes hiring people without proper documentation, so they could pay below minimum wage without legal consequences. These shortcuts allowed them to underbid honest companies and win contracts they shouldn't have won. James faced a choice. He could join them in cutting corners, could compromise his standards to stay competitive, or he could maintain his integrity, even if it meant his business might not survive. His accountant urged him to be practical, to do what was necessary to stay afloat. His wife worried about their family's security. The pressure to compromise was enormous, but James kept coming back to a proverb his father had taught him. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. And another, better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice. These weren't just nice sentiments. They were observations about how reality works, about what lasts and what doesn't, about the hidden costs of cutting corners. James decided to maintain his standards. He would not compromise on materials. He would not skip safety measures. He would pay his workers fairly. If that meant his business failed, then it failed. He would not build success on a foundation of deception and exploitation. The following years were hard. There were months when he wasn't sure he'd make payroll. There were times when he watched less scrupulous competitors win jobs by underbidding him. But he held firm, and gradually, something began to shift. The companies that had been cutting corners started experiencing consequences. Buildings developed problems. Clients discovered they'd been overcharged for materials they didn't receive. Workers filed complaints. Legal troubles emerged. Reputations were destroyed. The shortcuts that seemed so profitable in the short term became expensive disasters in the long term. Meanwhile, James's reputation for integrity grew. Clients who had been burned by dishonest contractors sought him out. They were willing to pay more for the assurance that the work would be done right, that they wouldn't face problems down the road, that they could trust what he told them. His business not only survived but began to thrive, not because he'd been lucky, but because he'd built on a foundation that could bear weight. More than that, James slept well at night. He faced his employees without shame. He looked his clients in the eye without fear that his deceptions would be discovered. He lived without the constant anxiety that comes from maintaining lies, from keeping track of corners you've cut, from worrying that your house of cards will collapse. The peace that comes from integrity turned out to be worth more than any amount of money he might have gained through compromise. This is what Proverbs means when it says, "Better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a rich man who is crooked in his ways." It's not saying poverty is better than wealth. It's saying that how you gain your wealth matters, that success built on integrity is real and lasting, while success built on deception is hollow and temporary, that the cost of compromising your principles is always higher than it appears at first. Proverbs also has much to say about anger and self-control. In our current moment, when so much of our interaction happens through screens, when social media rewards outrage and hot takes, when anger has become almost a form of entertainment, this wisdom is desperately needed. There was a man named Robert who prided himself on speaking his mind. He didn't hold back when he disagreed with someone. He didn't moderate his tone or choose his words carefully. He saw this as honesty, as authenticity, as refusing to be politically correct or fake. When someone said something he thought was wrong, he told them. When someone did something that bothered him, he let them know. He was, in his own mind, refreshingly direct. But over the years, Robert noticed a pattern. His relationships didn't last. Friendships that started well would cool after a few months. Romantic relationships would end after the initial attraction wore off, and his partner experienced his anger more directly. At work, he'd clash with supervisors, would get into conflicts with colleagues, would find himself isolated even as he convinced himself that he was just the only honest person in a room full of hypocrites. The breaking point came when his adult daughter told him she needed some distance from him. She loved him, but his constant anger, his harsh words, his inability to let things go was exhausting for her. She couldn't share anything with him without it becoming an opportunity for him to criticize, to tell her everything she was doing wrong, to express his anger about the world or her choices or whoever had annoyed him that week. She needed peace, and being around him was the opposite of peaceful. Robert was devastated. He hadn't seen this coming. In his mind, he'd been helping his daughter by being honest with her, by not coddling her, by telling her hard truths. But she experienced it as relentless negativity, as judgment, as a father who could never just be present with her without turning everything into a problem he needed to fix, or a wrong he needed to correct. For the first time, Robert was forced to look at his anger differently. He'd always justified it as righteous, as appropriate response to a world full of wrongs that needed to be called out. But what if his anger wasn't righteous? What if it was just destructive? What if his inability to control it wasn't strength but weakness? He remembered a proverb his mother used to quote, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." At the time, it had seemed like weak advice, like encouraging people to be doormats. But now he began to understand it differently. Real strength isn't about expressing every feeling that arises. Real strength is having feelings but choosing how to respond to them. Real power isn't in conquering others with your anger, but in mastering yourself. Robert began the hard work of change. He started noticing when anger arose instead of immediately acting on it. He learned to pause, to take a breath, to ask himself whether speaking his mind right now would actually help or just make things worse. He discovered that most of his angry reactions weren't about the present moment at all. They were old patterns, learned ways of responding, habits formed long ago that no longer served him. It wasn't quick or easy. He had to rebuild trust with his daughter over months, prove through consistent action that he was actually changing. He had to apologize to people he'd hurt, acknowledge ways his anger had damaged relationships. He had to accept that some bridges were burned beyond repair, that some consequences of his past behavior couldn't be undone. But as he learned to control his anger rather than being controlled by it, his life became better in ways he hadn't anticipated. He could actually hear what people were saying instead of just waiting for his turn to attack or defend. He could be present with others without every conversation becoming a battlefield. He discovered that people actually wanted to be around him when he wasn't a volcano ready to erupt. The ancient wisdom of Proverbs had been right all along. Ruling your own spirit is more valuable than conquering a city. Self-control is strength, not weakness. Being slow to anger is better than being mighty. Robert had spent years living as if the opposite were true, and it had cost him dearly. But he was grateful that he learned the truth before it was too late, before he'd alienated everyone who mattered to him. There's a theme in Proverbs that might seem strange to modern ears: the value of accepting correction. We live in a time when criticism is often seen as attack, when correction is interpreted as judgment, when people become defensive at the slightest suggestion that they might be wrong about something. But Proverbs suggests that this defensive posture is foolishness, that wisdom begins with being teachable. Let me tell you about a teacher named Rachel who learned this truth through working with students. Rachel taught high school English, and over her years in the classroom, she noticed a pattern. Some students would respond to feedback on their writing with immediate defensiveness. If she pointed out that an argument was unclear or that they needed more evidence for a claim, they would explain why she was wrong, why what they'd written was actually fine, why she just didn't understand what they meant. These students rarely improved because they spent all their energy defending their current level rather than learning to get better. Other students responded differently. They'd read her comments carefully, would ask questions to make sure they understood, would thank her for pointing out weaknesses they could strengthen. These students grew dramatically over the course of a semester, not because they were initially more talented, but because they were teachable. Rachel noticed this pattern extended beyond her classroom. Faculty meetings, some teachers responded to suggestions or criticism with openness, while others became defensive. In her personal life, some friends could hear feedback about ways they'd hurt her without becoming hostile, while others would turn any attempt to address a problem into a conflict. The difference wasn't about who was better or worse. It was about who could receive correction and who couldn't. One year, Rachel had a student named Lisa who was particularly resistant to feedback. Lisa was bright and had strong opinions, but her writing was often unclear and poorly organized. When Rachel would point this out, Lisa would become upset, would insist that Rachel was being unfair, would sometimes accuse her of having favorites or not understanding Lisa's unique style. It was exhausting, and Rachel began to dread returning Lisa's papers because she knew any criticism, however constructive, would lead to conflict. Partway through the school year, something shifted. Lisa came to Rachel after class and said, "I need to tell you something. My mom talked to me about how I've been responding to your feedback. She pointed out that I do this with everyone, not just you. I make it really hard for people to help me because I get so defensive. I'm realizing that I'm the one holding myself back. I want to learn to take correction better." From that point on, Lisa approached feedback differently. It wasn't that she never felt defensive, but she learned to notice that feeling and not immediately act on it. She'd read Rachel's comments, sit with them for a day, and then come back with questions rather than arguments. Her writing improved dramatically, not because Rachel changed how she taught, but because Lisa changed how she learned. Years later, Lisa wrote to Rachel. She was in college now, majoring in journalism. She thanked Rachel not for teaching her to write, but for being patient with her while she learned to accept correction. She said that learning to be teachable had changed everything for her. She could learn from professors, from editors, from other students. She wasn't defensive anymore because she understood that correction was a gift, not an attack. This transformation illustrated a proverb Rachel had always loved. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. Strong words, perhaps, but true. The word stupid here doesn't mean lacking intelligence. It means willfully choosing ignorance, refusing to learn when learning is available. Lisa, had been making herself stupid by hating reproof. When she learned to love discipline, to see correction as valuable, she became truly intelligent in a way that had nothing to do with IQ and everything to do with wisdom. As Rachel reflected on this over her years of teaching, she realized she needed to apply the same principle to her own life. She'd been teaching it to students, but was she living it? When her principal offered feedback about her teaching, did she receive it with openness or defensiveness? When her husband gently pointed out ways she could be a better partner, did she listen or argue? When her own children became old enough to offer perspectives on her parenting, could she hear them? She discovered that being teachable was a lifelong practice, not a destination you reached. There was always a temptation to defend yourself, to justify your current way of doing things, to resist change. But every time she chose openness over defensiveness, every time she listened to correction instead of arguing with it, she grew, and her life became richer for it. This is what Proverbs means when it repeatedly emphasizes the importance of accepting discipline and listening to instruction. It's not about being weak or passive or never having confidence in your own judgment. It's about recognizing that you have blind spots, that others can see things you can't, that growth requires being willing to discover you were wrong about something you were certain about. Wisdom isn't knowing everything. It's being open to learning more. The book of Proverbs speaks extensively about relationships, about choosing friends wisely, about the influence that companions have on our character. There's a proverb that says, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." This isn't just moralizing. It's observation of how human influence actually works. There was a young man named Alex who moved to a new city for work. He didn't know anyone and was eager to make friends. In his apartment building, he met a group of guys his age who seemed friendly and fun. They'd hang out in the evenings, watch games, go out together on weekends. Alex was grateful for the instant social circle in a city where he'd felt lonely. But gradually, Alex noticed that being around these guys was changing him in ways he didn't like. They drank heavily most nights. They talked about women in crude, disrespectful ways. They were cynical about work, about relationships, about pretty much everything. They mocked anyone who seemed to take life seriously or have strong convictions. Their humor was mean-spirited, usually at someone else's expense. At first, Alex thought he could be around them without being influenced. He'd just be himself. But he found that wasn't how it worked. To fit in, to be part of the group, he had to laugh at their jokes, even when he found them offensive. He had to participate in their drinking, even when he'd rather not. He had to adopt their cynical tone, even when it wasn't how he actually felt. Slowly, he was becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone his family wouldn't recognize. The turning point came when his mother visited. She took one look at him and said, "You seem different, not in a good way." She couldn't put her finger on exactly what had changed, but something fundamental had shifted. He seemed harder, more cynical, less like himself. After she left, Alex couldn't stop thinking about her observation. Was he different? He realized he was, and he didn't like who he was becoming. Alex remembered something his father used to say, a proverb about not entering the path of the wicked or going the way of evildoers. His new friends weren't evil in any dramatic sense. They weren't criminals or terrible people, but their path was leading somewhere he didn't want to go. Their way of looking at the world, their values, their daily choices, these were shaping him in ways he hadn't consciously chosen. he started pulling back from the group. It was lonely at first. He had to rebuild his social life from scratch, had to find different people to spend time with. He joined a running club, started attending a church, reached out to colleagues at work who seemed to share his values. These new connections formed more slowly. They weren't as immediately fun or easy as his old group, but they were better for him. They encouraged him to be his best self, rather than pressuring him to compromise his values to fit in. A year later, Alex looked back and realized how close he'd come to losing himself. If he'd stayed on that path, surrounded by those influences, he would have become someone his younger self wouldn't recognize or respect. The wisdom of Proverbs about choosing companions carefully had seemed like obvious advice when he first heard it. But living it out, actually making hard choices about who to spend time with, proved more difficult and more important than he'd imagined. Your friends shape you. Your companions influence who you become. This isn't about being judgmental or thinking you're better than other people. It's about recognizing that we're all influenced by those around us, and choosing those influences wisely is one of the most important decisions we make. Proverbs also speaks about work, about the dignity of honest labor and the foolishness of laziness. In our culture, we often have contradictory attitudes toward work. On one hand, we glorify hustle and constant busyness. On the other hand, we romanticize doing as little as possible, dream of passive income and retirement. Proverbs offers a more balanced view. There was a young woman named Maria who graduated from college with big dreams but little direction. She wanted to be successful, wanted to make money, wanted to enjoy life. But she had a tendency to take shortcuts, to look for the easy path, to avoid difficult or boring work if she could. Her first few jobs didn't last long. She'd get bored, would decide the work was beneath her or not interesting enough, would quit and look for something better. Her father, who had worked construction his entire life, would shake his head when Maria complained about her jobs. He'd quote Proverbs to her, "The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor." Or, "In all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends only to poverty." Maria found these sayings annoying. They seemed to glorify drudgery, to suggest that hard work was its own reward, even when it wasn't rewarding at all. But after several years of drifting from job to job, never quite finding what she was looking for, Maria began to notice something. The people she admired, the people who had careers she envied, had usually started at the bottom doing unglamorous work. They hadn't been too proud to do difficult or boring jobs. They'd learned their fields from the ground up, had developed skills through years of steady effort, had proven themselves reliable and capable. Meanwhile, Maria's resume was a mess of short-term jobs and gaps. Potential employers looked at it and saw someone who didn't stick with things, who probably wasn't reliable, who would leave as soon as something more interesting came along. Her search for the perfect job had prevented her from building any real career at all. Maria took a job as an assistant in a marketing firm. It was entry-level, didn't pay much, involved a lot of tedious tasks. But she decided to do something different this time. She would show up fully. She would do every task, even the boring ones, with excellence. She would be reliable, would learn everything she could, would prove herself valuable. She wouldn't quit just because it wasn't immediately rewarding. The first few months were hard. She had to fight her habitual impulse to look for something better as soon as things got difficult or boring. But she kept showing up, kept doing good work, kept learning. And gradually, people noticed. Her boss started giving her more responsibility. She learned about marketing in ways she never could have if she'd just been looking for a shortcut to success. She developed skills, relationships, reputation. 3 years later, Maria was managing projects that she found genuinely interesting. She made good money. She had a career path she was excited about. None of this came from finding the perfect job or taking shortcuts. It came from the patient, steady work of showing up day after day and doing what needed to be done, whether it was exciting or not. Looking back, Maria realized her father's Proverbs hadn't been about glorifying drudgery. They'd been about the connection between steady effort and real achievement. There are no shortcuts to genuine success. The path involves doing unglamorous work, learning through practice, building skill over time. The diligence her father talked about wasn't joyless grinding. It was the focused application of effort toward meaningful goals. It was refusing to be lazy when hard work was needed. This is what Proverbs means when it says, "The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied." It's not that lazy people don't want things. They often have big dreams and desires, but they want the rewards without the work. The diligent person understands that genuine achievement requires sustained effort, that there's dignity in honest labor, that the satisfaction of accomplishment comes from actually doing something difficult, not from finding a way around it. There's a section in Proverbs about the excellent wife that has often been misunderstood or misused. Some read it as prescriptive, as a list of requirements for women. But read more carefully. It's actually a portrait of wisdom embodied in daily life. It describes someone who is capable, industrious, generous, wise in speech, strong and dignified. These aren't gendered virtues. They're what wisdom looks like when it's lived out, regardless of who is living it. There was a woman named Grace who took care of her elderly mother while also working full-time and raising 2 teenagers. It was exhausting, overwhelming at times. She'd see other people's lives on social media and wonder how they seemed to have it all together, while she felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. She felt inadequate, felt like she was failing at everything because she couldn't do everything perfectly. One Sunday, her pastor read the passage about the excellent wife from Proverbs 31. Grace almost tuned out, tired of hearing about this impossible standard. But something in how the pastor explained it caught her attention. He pointed out that this wasn't a description of one day in a woman's life. It was a portrait of a whole life, showing different seasons and different capacities. The excellent wife wasn't doing all these things simultaneously. She was someone who, over the course of a life, demonstrated wisdom, capability, generosity, strength. More than that, the pastor noted, this passage comes as Grace listened more carefully now. The pastor explained that the passage wasn't meant to pressure anyone into perfection. It was meant to celebrate wisdom lived out in the real grind of daily life. Wisdom that shows up in work, in compassion, in patience, in strength, in resilience. Wisdom that builds a home, nurtures relationships, brings stability, and quietly shapes the people around you. Grace felt something loosen inside her. She'd always imagined the Proverbs 31 woman as someone who never got tired, never slipped, never forgot anything, never said the wrong thing. A superhero, an impossible ideal. But what if the passage wasn't describing perfection at all? What if it was describing faithfulness over time? A life pointed in the direction of wisdom, even if some days were messy and hard and far from glamorous. As she thought about it, Grace realized that she actually did embody many of the qualities described. just not in the dramatic, Instagram-ready way she'd always imagined wisdom should look. When she woke up early every morning to help her mother dress and eat, that was wisdom. When she showed up to work even on days when she felt emotionally drained, that was wisdom. When she stayed up late helping her teenagers with their homework or listening to their fears, that was wisdom. When she managed finances carefully, stretched every dollar, and kept the household running, that was wisdom. When she extended kindness to co-workers who were having a rough day, when she encouraged her children, when she forgave mistakes, when she chose patience instead of anger, all of that was wisdom. But because none of it felt heroic, she'd never seen it as valuable. Grace remembered another proverb. Wisdom is found in those who take advice. It struck her that she needed to take this advice herself, to shift how she saw her own life, to recognize the quiet glory in the work she did every day. She began to give herself more grace. She stopped demanding perfection from herself and instead started asking a new question. What is the wise thing to do in this moment? Sometimes the wise thing was pushing through exhaustion because something truly needed to be done. Other times, wisdom meant resting, saying no, or allowing someone else to help. She discovered that wisdom and strength weren't the same as busyness. They weren't about doing everything. They were about doing the right things with the right heart. Her life didn't suddenly become easy, but something inside her shifted. She moved through her days with a quieter confidence, aware that the work she was doing mattered, not because it was impressive, but because it was faithful. Months later, her daughter wrote her a note on Mother's Day. It said, "Mom, I don't know how you do it. You hold this whole family together. You make us feel safe. You work so hard for us. You're the strongest person I know." Grace cried reading those words, not because she finally felt seen, but because she realized something. The strength her daughter admired wasn't the strength of perfection. It was the strength of a wise life lived quietly, patiently, consistently. The very strength Proverbs celebrates. Wisdom often looks ordinary. It looks like showing up. It looks like patience. It looks like faithfulness. It looks like kindness when you're tired, discipline when you don't feel like it, integrity when no one's watching. And because it looks ordinary, we often miss how extraordinary it is. Another theme woven through Proverbs is generosity. Not just giving money, but cultivating a generous spirit. Being open-handed with time, encouragement, forgiveness, attention, compassion. Generosity, Proverbs suggests, expands life. Stinginess shrinks it. There was a shop owner named Evelyn who ran a small bakery in a quiet neighborhood. She didn't make huge profits. She wasn't famous. She didn't have investors or franchise plans or anything that looked like worldly success. But her bakery was the warm heart of the community. Every morning at 5 a.m., she'd unlock the doors, switch on the lights, and begin kneading dough while the oven warmed the shop. As the smell of fresh bread drifted into the street, customers would begin to wander in. Construction workers heading to job sites, nurses finishing night shifts, teachers on their way to school, elderly neighbors who just wanted a friendly face to start their day. People came for the pastries, yes, but they stayed because of Evelyn. She remembered everyone's name. She noticed when someone looked tired or sad. She slipped an extra roll into the bag of a struggling single mom. She sent pastries to the fire station on holidays. She set aside day-old bread for a local shelter. She employed teens in the neighborhood, giving them their first work experience. When people confided in her, heartbreak, stress, family problems, She listened with genuine care, offering just enough encouragement to help them keep going. Someone once asked her why she gave so much when her own life was modest. She smiled and quoted a proverb, "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer." Then she explained something many people never understand. Generosity isn't measured by the size of the gift, but by the openness of the heart behind it. Years passed, and the neighborhood changed. Rent increased. Big chain stores appeared. Many small shops closed. People worried they'd lose Evelyn's bakery too. But when the landlord threatened to raise the rent to a level she couldn't afford, something remarkable happened. Customers, neighbors, local businesses, even people who had moved away, came together. They launched a fundraiser. They collected testimonials. They talked to city officials. They petitioned the landlord. They raised money. They fought for her. Not because she had a marketing strategy, not because she asked for help, but because she had spent years pouring generosity into others, and now that generosity returned to her, multiplied. She kept the bakery, and even in her old age, when arthritis slowed her hands, her spirit remained open, warm, outward-facing. Proverbs had been right. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Another insight Proverbs offers is the importance of guarding the heart, for from it flow the springs of life. This line sounds poetic, but its meaning is deeply practical. Your inner world shapes your outer world. Your thoughts become attitudes. Your attitudes become choices. Your choices become habits. Your habits eventually become your life. There was a man named Daniel who discovered this truth slowly and painfully. Daniel had always been an outwardly successful person. He was well liked, good at his job, charming in conversation, the type of person people admired from a distance. But on the inside, he carried a quiet heaviness. He didn't deal with sadness head-on. He avoided conflict instead of resolving it. Whenever he felt hurt, he pushed the feeling down instead of processing it. Whenever he felt stressed, he distracted himself with work or entertainment until the feeling went numb. For years, this strategy seemed to work. From the outside, no one could tell anything was wrong. But the things he buried didn't disappear. They collected. They hardened. They became a quiet pressure inside him, subtle but constant. One day, after a tense argument with a colleague at work, Daniel snapped at her in a way that shocked everyone, including himself. His reaction was disproportionate to the situation, fueled by something deeper than the moment. The colleague reported the incident. Daniel was suspended. And as he sat alone in his apartment that evening, he realized something he'd spent years avoiding. He didn't know how to handle his own heart. He remembered a proverb he'd heard in Sunday school long ago. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. That's how he felt. Unprotected, exposed, vulnerable to anything that stirred inside him. In the quiet of that suspension week, Daniel did something he'd never done before. He sat down with a journal and wrote every feeling he'd been suppressing. Anger, grief, resentment, disappointment, fear. The pages filled with words he didn't know he'd been carrying. When he finished, he felt lighter, but also unsettled. It was the first time he'd realized that ignoring emotions doesn't eliminate them. It only forces them to leak out in destructive ways later. He decided to make a change. He began therapy. He learned tools for emotional awareness. He apologized sincerely to the colleague he'd hurt, this time without defensiveness or excuses. And slowly, he began to understand what Proverbs meant by guarding your heart. To guard your heart doesn't mean suppressing emotions. It means paying attention to them. It means keeping watch over what enters. Bitterness is like patching a wall while ignoring the foundation. Guarding the heart is a daily practice. And for Daniel, it changed everything. Another theme that shines through Proverbs is the danger of envy, a quiet cancer that corrodes gratitude, distorts perspective, and steals joy. There was a photographer named Leah who lived in a big city filled with creatives. Her work was good, thoughtful, emotional, beautifully composed. She had steady clients and a growing portfolio. But no matter how well she did, she constantly compared herself to others. Someone else had more followers on social media. Another photographer got published in a major magazine. Someone else landed a celebrity client. Another won awards she felt she deserved. Every time someone else succeeded, Leah felt smaller. It wasn't that she wanted them to fail. She just wanted to feel like she was enough, and she never did. Her envy didn't erupt in dramatic ways. Instead, it showed up quietly. She'd scroll social media for hours, her mood sinking. She'd criticize her own work harshly. She'd secretly hope others' projects wouldn't do well. She'd lose motivation because she felt she would never catch up. Her creativity dimmed. Her joy faded. Her work became mechanical. One day, after a particularly frustrating photo shoot, she shut her camera off, sat in her tiny studio, and felt nothing. No inspiration, no ambition, no excitement. Only exhaustion. She opened her Bible randomly and landed on this verse. A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. The words hit her like cold water. She realized she'd been nurturing rotting thoughts, letting them seep into her work, her confidence, her relationships. She'd allowed envy to consume the joy that had once made her love photography. So Leah made a decision. For 1 month, she would unfollow every account that triggered comparison. Not out of bitterness, but to detox her heart. She would only consume art that inspired her, not art that fed her insecurity. She would celebrate one photographer every week, publicly, whether she felt like it or not. She would create not from pressure, but from play. The first week was painful. The second week was peaceful. By the fourth week, she felt different, freer, more creative, more herself. Her work began to flourish again, not because she was trying to outdo anyone, but because she was focused on her own gift, her own journey, her own purpose. Months later, Leah hosted a small gallery show. Her photographs glowed with emotion. Stillness, gratitude, wonder, all the things she'd rediscovered when she stopped competing and started living. Envy had made her bones rot. Letting go of comparison had given her life again. Another principle Proverbs returns to again and again is humility. The willingness to see truth about yourself, to take responsibility, to listen, to admit when you've been wrong, to stay grounded even when life lifts you up. There was a CEO named Anthony who had risen from nothing. His childhood had been rough. Poverty, instability, a neighborhood where trouble lurked on every corner. When he finally succeeded, it was through relentless work, sharp instincts, and sheer determination. But success changed him. At first, he simply enjoyed the fruits of his labor. But slowly, subtly, something shifted inside him. He became impatient with employees. He stopped listening to feedback. He belittled people who questioned him. He dismissed the concerns of his board. He began to believe that everything he touched would succeed simply because he was the one touching it. The warning signs were there, but he ignored them. Until one day, a major deal collapsed because he refused to consider the risks others had warned him about. Investors pulled out. The company's stock plummeted. His reputation took a hit he'd never imagined possible. For the first time in years, he felt small again. Not in the humble, grounded way, but in the exposed, unprepared way pride leaves you when it finally breaks. That's when an old proverb his grandmother used to quote returned to him. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, but humility comes before honor. He finally understood. Humility isn't weakness. It's strength that knows its limits. It's confidence grounded in reality, not ego. It's vision informed by listening, not arrogance. Anthony sought counsel. He restructured his leadership team. He met privately with employees, not to lecture, but to listen. He apologized to those he'd wronged, genuinely, without excuses. He rebuilt trust slowly, carefully, consistently. The company didn't recover overnight, but over the next 2 years, it stabilized, then grew stronger than before. Not because Anthony was brilliant, but because he had become wise. He had rediscovered humility, the gateway to honor. Another truth Proverbs emphasizes is the deceptiveness of shortcuts. Not just financial shortcuts, but moral shortcuts, emotional shortcuts, relational shortcuts, spiritual shortcuts. We live in a world that promises quick results and instant gratification, but Scripture insists that the fastest path is rarely the wisest one. There was a young man named Rohan who dreamed of becoming a musician. He had real talent, a warm voice, a unique tone, and the ability to write lyrics that felt deeply honest. But talent alone isn't enough in a world where thousands compete for the same spotlight. Real success required discipline, practice, strategy, connection, and patience. Rohan didn't like patience. He wanted the big moments, the stage, the applause, the viral hit. He didn't want the slow part, practicing scales, refining lyrics, studying music theory, facing criticism, performing at small cramped cafes for 10 people who barely listened. So when an acquaintance introduced him to a producer who promised fast success, Rohan jumped at it. The producer claimed he could make Rohan famous quickly. All he needed was to change his look, adjust his style, and start releasing the kind of songs people wanted to hear rather than the songs he genuinely felt. Rohan agreed. He changed everything. His clothes, his sound, even the topics he wrote about. The producer began writing songs for him, songs that didn't say anything meaningful but were catchy enough for the algorithm. For a moment, it worked. One song went moderately viral. Rohan gained followers. People recognized him. He tasted the attention he'd been craving. But that moment passed quickly. His next song flopped, then the next. The producer moved on to a new artist. His audience, built on superficial attention, drifted away, and Rohan was left feeling hollow. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd succeeded in becoming someone he didn't recognize. He remembered a proverb his mother used to quote in Hindi. "Jo jaldi milta hai, वो जल्दी चला भी जाता है. And the biblical version of that truth, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be full of gravel. That's exactly how it felt. The sweetness of early attention turned into the gravel of emptiness and regret. So Rohan went back to the basics. He started performing at small cafes again. He took music classes. He wrote songs that were true to his story, even if they weren't trendy. He relearned how to enjoy music for its own sake. It took 2 years of quiet dedication, 2 years of slow growth, 2 years of steady improvement. And then, one night, he performed a song he'd written about his father. Raw, emotional, vulnerable. Someone recorded it and posted it online. Not because it was meant to go viral, but because it touched them. This time, the attention wasn't superficial. People connected with the honesty, the simplicity, the truth. Rohan's career grew from that moment, not explosively, but steadily, grounded in authenticity. He never forgot the proverb he'd once ignored. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. Haste had given him a taste of success. Diligence gave him something real. Another idea Proverbs returns to again and again is the danger of isolation. The wise walk with others. They seek counsel. They surround themselves with people who sharpen, challenge, and encourage them. There was a woman named Naomi who took pride in being fiercely independent. She'd grown up in a home where asking for help led to criticism, where vulnerability felt unsafe. So she learned to rely only on herself, emotionally, financially, socially. She didn't share problems with friends. She didn't ask for advice. She didn't open up when she was struggling. On the surface, it seemed like strength. On the inside, it was loneliness. When her marriage began to fracture, she told no one. She hid the tension, the arguments, the emotional distance. She believed she had to figure it out on her own. She believed that needing people meant weakness. But the weight grew heavier, and without anyone to speak into her life, to comfort her, to challenge her, to pray for her, to give perspective, she sank deeper into confusion and despair. One afternoon, after a painful argument, Naomi found herself in her car, tears filling her eyes. She felt overwhelmed and directionless. That's when a verse she hadn't thought of since childhood came back to her. Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. Naomi finally reached out to a close friend, something she had never done. She expected judgment. Instead, her friend listened. She didn't blame Naomi. She didn't minimize her pain. She simply sat with her, cried with her, and helped her see clearly. Over the next few months, Naomi widened her circle. A therapist, a support group, a mentor couple. Each person offered a piece of the clarity she needed. Each provided encouragement, wisdom, and perspective. Her marriage didn't magically fix itself. But Naomi changed. Her heart softened. Her communication improved. She became more patient, more honest, more present. Her husband noticed. Real conversations began. Healing took root, slowly, but genuinely. Naomi realized something profound. Independence had been her armor. Community became her healing. She finally understood the truth behind another proverb. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. We don't grow by walking alone. We grow by walking with the right people. Another idea Proverbs highlights is the way small habits determine the course of a life. Not dramatic events, but tiny daily choices. A little laziness here, a small compromise there, or a small discipline here, a quiet act of integrity there. There was a man named Felix. who wanted to improve his health. He wasn't severely unwell, but he felt low energy, slept poorly, and struggled to stay focused. He believed the solution would be dramatic: a strict diet, a hardcore fitness plan, a complete lifestyle overhaul. He tried everything intensely for about 1 week. Then exhaustion and discouragement followed. One morning he was reading Proverbs and saw this verse: "The sluggard does not plough in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing." It wasn't really about farming. It was about seasons. It was about consistency. It was about doing small things now so you can experience big things later. Felix realized he didn't need to overhaul his life. He just needed small habits, done consistently, not perfectly. So he began walking for 15 minutes each morning. He drank 1 extra glass of water each day. He went to bed 20 minutes earlier. He read 1 chapter of a book per day. He replaced 1 unhealthy meal each week. He practiced gratitude for 2 minutes before bed. The changes were tiny, almost laughably small, but they were doable, and they were sustainable. In 3 weeks, he felt a little better. In 3 months, he felt noticeably different. In a year, his life didn't even resemble the one he'd started with. His relationships improved. His mental clarity increased. His stress decreased. His physical health improved. His confidence grew. He finally understood another proverb: little by little a man grows wealthy. Little by little, step by step, habit by habit. Not dramatic transformation, but daily faithfulness. Small seeds, big harvest. One of the most subtle yet powerful teachings in Proverbs is the importance of delayed gratification. The ability to choose what is better later instead of what is easier now. Many people underestimate how life-changing this single principle is. It shapes finances, relationships, discipline, character, and future stability. There was a college student named Amelia who struggled with impulsive choices. She wasn't reckless, just deeply driven by emotion. When she felt stressed, she'd spend money to feel better. When she felt lonely, she'd jump into relationships too quickly. When she felt bored, she'd procrastinate to escape the discomfort of discipline. Her life was filled with unfinished projects, fleeting relationships, unnecessary debt, and constant anxiety. One night, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, she came across a short video where someone read a proverb aloud: "Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours all he has." She paused the video. Something about that verse unsettled her. She realized she devoured everything as soon as she felt anything. Her money, her time, her attention, her energy. She lived for the immediate emotion, not the long-term result. And the long-term results were catching up to her. Amelia took a notebook and began to write down every impulsive decision she'd made in the past month. The list shocked her. She saw hundreds of small choices that had created the life she was now overwhelmed by. She thought her problems were big, mysterious forces, but they were actually 1,000 tiny impulses unchecked. She made a new rule for herself. When emotions speak loudly, wisdom speaks last. It didn't mean she ignored emotions. It meant she didn't act on them until clarity arrived. When she wanted to buy something impulsively, she waited 48 hours. When she wanted to text an ex out of loneliness, she waited until the next morning. When she wanted to procrastinate, she made herself work for just 10 minutes before deciding. When she felt like quitting a commitment, she waited until the emotion passed. None of these rules were dramatic, but they were powerful. Within a few weeks, her life calmed. Within a few months, her savings grew. Within a year, Her entire approach to life transformed. She became thoughtful, steady, grounded. She built relationships more intentionally, protected her finances, managed stress wisely, and took responsibility for her choices. The proverb had proved true. Those who devour what they have never build anything lasting. Those who delay gratification quietly accumulate the treasures that sustain a wise life. Another theme in Proverbs is honesty. Not just telling the truth, but living truthfully. Being transparent, consistent, and authentic. Being the same person in private as in public. There was a respected pastor named Jonathan, who had a powerful gift for preaching. People admired him. His church grew rapidly. His sermons were shared widely. But over time, he began to feel the pressure of maintaining a flawless image. He feared the congregation's expectations, feared disappointing people, feared vulnerability. So he built a second life, not scandalous, but hidden. He struggled with anxiety, but pretended he was always peaceful. He struggled with doubt, but preached like he was always certain. He struggled with loneliness, but pretended to be spiritually strong. He struggled with exhaustion, but spoke as if he rested perfectly in God's presence. This internal division exhausted him. He felt like two different people, and the crack between his real self and his public self widened with each passing month. One night after a midweek service, he stayed alone in the empty sanctuary, weighed down by the pressure to be more than human. He opened his Bible and read, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them." He knew the verse wasn't accusing him of treachery. It was warning him about pretending. Integrity isn't perfection. Integrity is unity. Being whole. Being the same person everywhere. That night, Jonathan made a decision. He would live truthfully, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. The next Sunday, he stood before the congregation and did something he'd never done. He told the truth about himself. He shared about his anxiety, his fears, his doubts, his exhaustion. He didn't dramatize it, and he didn't collapse under it. He simply allowed the real person inside him to meet the people who loved him. To his surprise, the congregation didn't lose respect for him. They gained it. People cried. People thanked him. People came forward to share their own struggles. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt free. His leadership deepened. His relationships became real. His preaching became more powerful, not because it sounded perfect, but because it sounded true. Proverbs had been right. Integrity guides. Pretending destroys. Another teaching. Proverbs emphasizes strongly is the power of choosing peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the pursuit of calm, kindness, and steady spirit. There was a woman named Tessa who lived in a home filled with tension. Not because her family was toxic, but because she reacted explosively to every small irritation. If someone left dishes in the sink, she snapped. If a co-worker made a mistake, she ranted. If traffic was slow, she lost her temper. If her plans changed unexpectedly, she spiraled. Her outbursts weren't vicious. They were simply intense. But intensity, over time, can feel like aggression. Her home became a place of walking on eggshells. Her husband grew quiet. Her children avoided telling her bad news. Her friends slowly stepped back. One afternoon, after a particularly tense argument with her teenage daughter, Tessa sat alone in her living room, frustrated and ashamed. She didn't mean to be this way. She didn't want her family to fear her reactions. But she felt powerless, like her emotions ran ahead of her before she could grab hold of them. She opened her Bible randomly and found this verse. Better is a dry crust with peace than a house full of feasting with strife. It stunned her. She'd always been focused on providing good meals, a clean home, a structured environment, opportunities for her children. She wanted her home to be full of abundance, but it lacked peace. And what good is provision without peace? That single verse reshaped her priorities. She decided that peace, not productivity, would be her offering to her family. She practiced lowering her voice when upset. She learned to pause before responding. She apologized quickly when she reacted harshly. She began journaling her feelings before confronting others. She created quiet moments in her day, 10 minutes of stillness that softened her inner world. Changes came slowly, but they came. The tension eased. Her family relaxed. Her daughter began confiding in her again. Her husband started sharing his feelings instead of avoiding conflict. Her friends noticed her growing gentleness. The wisdom of Proverbs had proven true. Peace is a gift you build, one response at a time.